The Korean peninsula saw far more than its share of hardship throughout the 20th century, culminating in the division of the nation into North and South. With that said, we tend to focus on the current friction between these states rather than how they were formed. In this video, we're going to take a look at the ragtag group of 30 Korean officers who banded together to form the Korean Liberation Army and who eventually laid the foundation for the nation we now know as South Korea. Although at this point it's probably hard to lay the foundation to an entire nation, you can definitely lay a foundation to protect your own data with Incogni. We live in a world where your data is collected and sold without you even knowing about it. The good news is that you have the right to request data brokers to delete any information they have about you and to protect your privacy. The bad news is that if you were to do this manually, it would take years. This is where Incogni steps in. Incogni automates the entire data removal process and only requires you complete 3 steps to protect your privacy. First, create an account and tell them whose personal data they'll be requesting to remove. Second, grant Incogni the right to work for you, which will then trigger the process of Incogni contacting the data brokers and requesting your information is removed from their databases. Third, sit back and relax while Incogni handles any objections and keeps you updated on their progress every step of the way. If you're sick and tired of, say, subscribing to a free newsletter and then receiving ungodly amounts of spam a few days later, or searching for some specific information only to find you're being bombarded with ads for similar services, be sure to click the link in the description. The first 100 people to use code FRONT at the link below will get 20% off Incogni. Make sure to act now and protect your privacy. To understand what came to pass, we have to travel back to 1910, when the Japanese Empire officially annexed Korea after years of intimidation and war. Life in Korea under the Japanese occupation was tough, to put it mildly. What the Japanese did, or attempted to do, was nothing short of a genocide of Korean history and culture. They burned over 200,000 historical Korean documents, banned the Korean language in schools, universities, and virtually all public spaces, instead favoring Japanese, and even tore down a third of the 14th century royal palace. But of course, the Japanese didn't stop there. They stole land from the Korean people and gave it to some 100,000 newly arrived Japanese settlers who raised forests and replaced them with non-native species, effectively transforming the land into something unrecognizable. The Korean people were expected to be blindly loyal to their occupiers, but the Japanese certainly didn't make it easy for them. Koreans became forced laborers both at home and abroad, as some 725,000 Koreans were sent back to Japan to work back-breaking jobs. And for Korean women, the worst atrocities they faced during the Second World War were when hundreds of thousands of teenage girls and young women were plucked from the streets by Japanese soldiers, sold to brothels as comfort women, and forced to work as sex slaves for the Japanese military exclusively. Despite this incredible hardship, the Korean people were far from submissive. There were protests from the very beginning, and they grew with time. In 1919, a movement called March 1st sparked more than 1,500 independence protests throughout the peninsula. The Japanese did not take kindly to this, brutally suppressing the demonstrations. But in their eyes, the damage had already been done. It was clear the Korean people would fight for their independence. After the March 1st protests, the Korean Provisional Government, or KPG, was forced to flee the peninsula and set up shop in Shanghai, which became its base until the end of World War II. As such, Shanghai became a rallying point for other Koreans in exile. Throughout the 1920s, the Korean independence movement grew, and the Japanese stamped out all dissenting activity they could. Some separatists were killed, some were taken prisoner, and some were exiled. Many of these exiled freedom fighters were not ready to give up just because they were forced to leave their home. They formed small guerrilla armies throughout mainland China and Manchuria, fighting the Japanese in both China and Northern Korea in the hopes of liberating their people and winning their independence. The Chinese government, which promoted the legitimacy of the KPG, encouraged it to unite a few of these guerrilla armies in December 1941 after the KPG declared war on the Axis. These united armies became known as, you guessed it, the Korean Liberation Army, or KLA. Its motto was, "Long live the Korean independence." At its inception, the KLA was made up of just 30 officers. The army would grow to include 339 soldiers in active service by the end of the war. This was due in no small part to the socialist guerrillas who joined the KLA in 1943, but we'll come back to that soon. The Chinese government allowed the KLA to operate within its borders, but only if it fought alongside the Chinese army for the Allies. As a result, the KLA was sent all over Asia to fight the Japanese with the Allies, with a small group of them being recruited to fight with the British. On August 29, 1943, just 9 members of the KLA were sent to India, where they were trained for special operations in Delhi and Calcutta. For 2 years, those 9 soldiers carried out these special operations throughout India, including in Imphal, Kangla Tongbi, Urkul, Dimapur, Bishanpur and Tidim. They participated in sending propaganda broadcasts to the enemy, publishing propaganda magazines, decoding documents, and interrogating prisoners. Their operations also carried over into Burma, where they took part in the battles of Mandalay and Yangon in 1945. After that, they were sent home, where their peers welcomed them as heroes. This was because they were the only KLA soldiers to serve on the front line during World War II. The KLA's efforts in the war and participation in operations earned them a promise during the 1943 Cairo Conference from the British, Americans and Chinese that there would be a liberated Korea at the end of the war. This promise was reaffirmed by the Soviets, who joined in on the guarantee in the Potsdam Conference of 1945. That same year, the KLA was finally able to shift its focus back onto winning independence for Korea. It began working with the US Office of Strategic Services to train men for special operations, but now on their home turf. The units were set to depart on August 20th, but much to their surprise, the Japanese surrendered on the 15th, following the atomic bombings and Soviet declaration of war. The collapse of the Japanese Empire meant that Korea was finally independent. The joy surrounding Japan's exit from Korea was short-lived. After having declared war on Japan, the Soviets continued to attack the Japanese, moving from Manchuria into Korea, and soon they took over the northern half of the Korean peninsula. The US drafted an agreement called General Order No. 1, which stated that all Japanese forces north of the 38th parallel would surrender to the Soviets, and all Japanese forces south of it would surrender to the US. And just like that, Korea was divided into 2 spheres of influence with opposing ideologies. In 1946, the KLA was disbanded by the provisional government, which felt the KLA was no longer necessary now that the Japanese were gone. The following year, the KPG was also dissolved because the Americans feared it aligned too strongly with communist ideology. However, while there were some communist-leaning members in the KLA and KPG, not all of them were communists. After the groups were disbanded, the non-communist members from both organizations joined the new government forming in the South under the Democratic Republic ideology the South still holds today. Among the KLA members to join the government in the South were Cheong-Cheon and Beom-Seok. Cheong-Cheon had been a Korean independence activist since 1919, where he defected from the Japanese Imperial Army to join the Korean guerrilla fighters in the north. His knowledge of modern military tactics he learned from the Japanese eventually earned him the position of Commander-in-Chief of the KLA. Following the war, he became a member of South Korea's National Assembly. Beom-Seok became a Korean independence activist when he was just a teenager. In 1919, he enrolled at the Shin Military School, a school dedicated to training young Korean activists to fight for independence. That eventually led him to the KLA, where he served as a general. When he returned to Korea in 1946, following years of exile, he began working in politics, where he aligned himself with Ri Sung-man. The two worked together to form South Korea's government, with Ri eventually serving as the country's first president and Lee serving as the first prime minister. Former KLA members were integral to the formation of the South Korean government. They served all through the Korean War and worked to unify Korea. While their dream of independence was realized, their dream of reunifying the peninsula didn't occur in their lifetimes, and 70 years later, it still hasn't come to pass. The KLA has a lasting legacy in South Korea. The country's National Armed Forces Day falls on October 1st, but there has been a push in recent years to change it to September 17th to honor the day the Korean Liberation Army was formed back in 1941. But what do you think? Did the KLA influence the formation of South Korea in any ways we didn't mention? What else could South Korea do to honor its legacy? Do you hold out hope for a reunified Korea? Let us know in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.